right, so in this segment, we're going to have a little brief definition of religion. What exactly is religion? And again, as I mentioned before, a lot of this reading I would be doing would be verbatim. I don't leave any points out when it comes to the way Ra'u Nephra Men put these together, because he did a phenomenal job. So moving forward, I'm going to read again verbatim, and maybe ad-lib here and there. So the analysis of a word, religion, shows that it is to the right side of the brain what a glove is to the hand. The word is composed of the Latin prefix re, meaning again, back, to lagere, meaning tie, bind, fasten, meaning tie, bind, fasten, as well as the Indo-European root leg, meaning to collect, from whence the Greek legion and the Latin legere, meaning logic, and lego. Now, from this, I'm just like, what's going on here? But I guess what he's trying to say is that, as I was saying, even with Hebrew and Medu, Metur, every lingo has a meaning of something, whether it's logic, legal, Latin roots, European roots. That's what I was getting out of it. So moving forward, the original oneness is amplified by the prefix re, meaning back again, and the natural connectivity is explicit in the root, meaning law and logic. So right at the outset, we can see that in the meaning of the word itself, according to its components, religion was not thought to be opposed to reason and logic, which are the biggest foundations of science and philosophy, and more on this later. But they are the biggest foundations. So we have seen that the predominant functions of the right side of the brain is a unifying or collecting of synthesizing one. Religion is therefore nothing more than one of its organized expressions. So its concern with realities existing beyond the visible is a further proof of its intrinsic relationship to the right hemisphere. So we can thus conclude that all efforts by left-sided cultures that are aimed at creating religious doctrines and practices must produce results of the expected mark. Western religions are good examples. So we will see that the Hebraic Christians religions are hybrids resulting from the juxtaposition of a left hemispheric thought process upon religious doctrines created by right or balanced hemispheric cultures. The same can be said for Hinduism and Islam, although they have maintained a greater faithfulness to the fundamental culture upon which they are based. Now, as religion concerns itself with the inner realm of being, its main vehicle is the phenomena of the trance. Proficiency in this state, which we will later define, gives one full acquaintance with the metaphysical realm. On one hand, communication with the two classes of entities dwelling therein, the dead ancestors and the spirits administering natural phenomena, angels, deities, becomes possible. On the other hand, first-hand knowledge of men's metaphysics, higher vehicles, and the experience of man's true relation with God and all the creatures are attained. The central theme of this discourse becomes clear when we take note of the fact that while Westerners believe in the survival of the spirit after death, they have no tradition of ancestors worship, for example, communicating with the deceased. Now, the reason is clear, and it is for the lack of a culture of trance working, which is the only means to that end. Now, I'm going to pause there because I was, again, into my astrology, and I was watching this illustration on YouTube. A lady was explaining the Kabbalah, And she literally said in the midst of her presentation that she can feel a higher connection on this tree, but she couldn't connect with it. Now, carrying on, that same holds true for angels. So while Western religions claim belief in their existence, these metaphysical dwellers have been banished of late to the pages of the scriptures. Now, the ability through trance to communicate with deceased beings has led blacks to the greatest understanding of the nature of man. It has provided us with an inner empirical evidence of the immortality of men. The immortality is not merely the survival of the spirit, but of one's identity across incarnations. Usarians, resurrections, incarnations. On one hand, because of the pricelessness of the revelation that man is immortal, and on the other hand, because of the unparalleled guidance that ancestors provide, rituals for communication with the ancestors play a prominent role in the religion of Black nations. Or they call them ancestors, the so-called ancestors worship, play a prominent role in the religion of Black nations. It is instructive to note that the greatest architectural marvels of the ancient civilization, Kemet, Mohenjo-Daro, etc., were burial shrines. Now, entire cities were filled with these structures, pyramids, etc., that surpassed in opulence the dwellings of even the kings. In place of this insight, Western scholars could only see what they believed to be the work of the megalomaniacal builders. The megalomaniacal builders. Now, only from the ancestors, the living proof of life after death could have been learned from the observance and practice that led to the immortality, the survival of an individual's identity across incarnations. Metatron. Participation in a series of African and Oriental rituals will reveal to all that women in general can attain to the trance state with greater ease and power than men. Societies Now, societies that have a deep appreciation for the synthetical thinking and the introversion due to their right-sidedness or the equilibration cannot fail then to hold in great esteem their women. So just the opposite is found in the left-sided societies, and it's no wonder then to find that in all Black nations, not led astray by whites, but women and goddesses occupy positions and play roles equaling those of the males. So women in Kemet and other Black nations of antiquity occupy positions not yet achieved by Western women to date. Okay, I mean, we can always put that in account. How many women actually went and tried for president? Or how many people would have went on and tried for president if they had let us. As queen mothers, they determined the transference of the kingship and legitimize. As queen mothers, they determined the transference of kingship and legitimized the king. Inheritance was through them. That is, they held the wealth of the nation. They were the priestesses in their own right. And it is a matter of record that the goddesses whose shrines they were responsible for commanded greater importance than those of the gods in many cases. In contrast, we find Western women just beginning to make headway in their struggle for equality 6,000 years behind their Black counterparts. Where is the female rabbi, imam, bishop, etc.? Ra'un Ephraim goes on to summarize and make a point to the fact that what he has done is to simply carry to the logical conclusion well-known facts that were regarding in the divisions of the brains and the functions and how we think as a nation, as people. It was not until the early part of the 1950s that Western scientists began to understand fully that the higher functions of the human brain were divided between hemispheres. Teams of surgeons, psychologists, neurologists, biologists discovered that the two hemispheres process information regarding the same things in diametrically opposed yet complementary ways. Now, unfortunately, Western scientists went on to characterize the separate functions of each hemisphere by wild generations. In wild generalizations, they continue to go on, as I mentioned. But the left side governs language, scientific thinking, etc., for example. So even wilder generalizations were given. The left and the right hemisphere, respectively, were said to differ from each other in that the first is intellectual and the other intuitive. Again, intellectual versus sensuous, secondary versus primary and Freud. The deductive versus imaginative, the realistic versus the impulsive. We goes on to say the discursive versus the eidetic, idyllic, basically psychology versus physiology. Okay, there is a bit of truth in some of these statements, but they cannot be accepted without due caution and corrections. So we will deal with them later as he goes on. Ra'un Ephraim will go on in chapters and explain that differently. It has also been recognized that in some people, the functions of the left hemisphere predominate, while others, those of the right side, do. So again, characteristically, men think left side, women think more right side. So central to our discourse is the fact that the characteristics of Western culture are predominantly the productions of the left hemisphere of the brain, while the characteristic of Black and most other non-Western cultures are the of the right. Now, earlier we were talking about the place of tempos in the book, and he says, this European concept of separate beings or substance which find themselves side by side, entirely independent one of another, is foreign to the Bantu. The Bantu, again, is an African group, so it's a Bantu thought. And in this observation, which is one of the 1,000 implicit but most equivocally, states that something in the European makes them see the postulate differences, while something in the Bantu, which again is the African, which includes the ancient Egyptians, makes them see and postulate unity when viewing the same reality. Okay. Again, we can go on in the legacy of Egypt, and Barb state that although Westerners are now in the possession of dictionaries and grammars of the Egyptian language, they are not in the position to understand it, because the Egyptian way of thinking is so utterly different from our Western logical mind. Again, one has to be obtuse not to see that what Barb refers to as the European logical mind is the predominance of the left side of the brain. So, of course, the statements must be corrected to, symbolize each other logically. For the right side has a logical function of its own. Now, Barb does go on to conclude by referring to the impossibility of translating Egyptian thoughts into modern language. Now, for this distinction, we cannot avoid making did not exist for the Egyptians. It begs several questions. So why can't Europeans avoid making distinctions that do not exist for the Egyptians? Or equally valid, why cannot the Egyptians avoid unifying and synthesizing where Westerns cannot avoid segregating and analyzing? Now, before we answer these questions, let's dispose of the racist statements modern, because it is a tool of the theory to evolutionism that holds the black races and their cultural expressions amplifying the primitive phases of mankind, while the white race represents the more evolved modern. Now, the observation made by many scholars concerning the difference in thinking between African people and Westerns can only be intellectually explained by reference to the hemispheres of the brain. Now, in the cultural expression of the individual nation of an entire race share the same trait. Analytically, for example, it can only be because their thinking is dominated by the left hemisphere. So fortunately, we don't have to speculate on the issues for the simple fact that it is well known by professors and professionals in this area that Western scientists have long arrived at the conclusion that Western culture is predominantly left-sided, and it is now attempting very strongly to introduce into the school systems that are methods out there that make more use of the right hemisphere, which is great. Now, this has been especially encouraged by the discovery that such educational methods that appear to the right side of the brain excel greatly over those of the left. Super learning, accelerated learning. Okay? So examples of this are superlatives. They are being thrown around as they are finding that such methods shorten the learning period 2 to 20 times faster and produce a greater yield in understanding and retention. Now, over the left side, that's about 5,000% in the same time span. Now, in this reason why Black nations were the first to achieve a high level of civilization, we will see that it is. The techniques used in current super learning systems are nothing more than a minor fraction of the techniques used in traditional African from time immemorial. So by pretending that the whole thing is a recent Western discovery and invention, Westerns are dooming themselves to stagnation again. They need to humbly ask the African people to show them the way. As I mentioned before, you can stare at that chart and those trees forever, but you would never get to the tree that you want to be in if you don't sometimes ask for help. A study of literature on the brain hemisphere will show that analytically the segregative thinking are carried out by the left hemisphere, while the other side, which is the synthetical thinking, is done by the right side. Now let's put it in another way. The left side is responsible for the differences we make between things. It is the author, for example, of the Western attitude of seeing themselves as being separate from nature and therefore ruining the ecological balance, killing off whose species of animals, polluting the air, the soil, etc., of denying diet a significant role in healing. Poisons play a higher role of racial and sexual discrimination and so forth, okay? Now, on the other hand, the ecological mindfulness of most other non-Western people, for example, must be attributed to the dominance of the right hemisphere in their thinking, the respect and high regards for their women. It is the result of the same function. A most important expression of the right side of the brain concerns the non-Western belief and the indivisibility between all things in the world. Now, Ra'u Nefer al-Man goes on to say that far more being more intellectual notion, it is the basis of their entire way of life. Affect one thing and all others as well. The Western men's response to this is to call it primitive animism. Fortunately, it's just a word without objective reality. But it is not the foundation of religion to tie lesion back the things that have been separated. See, unity states the Kabbalah is the foundation of good, while disunity is the foundation of evil. Egotism, a failure to experience the interdependence between humans, is a function of the left side, and a major problem that religion sees as a chief obstacle to spiritual life. So we will see that the cure for egotism is the activation of the right side of the brain. We will also see that the religions of the Black nations were well acquainted with the dualization of the spirit, the knowledge of the good and evil. And it made its unification a foundation of their spiritual tradition. So what today the Western man calls the functions of the hemispheres of the brain, the Comatians refer to it as two truths, Mayat and Tayu. So as the doctrine of the yin and the yang and the dogons and the twin pneumo serpents that govern the various aspects of the world. Finally, we must note that the racial differences go beyond the color of the skin, the type of hair, the skeletal structure, and any other psychosynconomical items. Physiognomical. I'll look that up later. So, basically, characteristically, anatomy. I could define that in a moment. Alexa, define physiognomical.
Sorry, I don't have an answer for that.
So I must be pronouncing it wrong. But we'll get back to that. So in future chapters, we will accumulate all the evidence to show that there is a cultural unity among all white nations and all Black nations and all Oriental nations. And that the common factors in each are traceable to the hemispheres of the brain that dominates their thinking, their language, and cultural expressions. And finally, that since the behavior of nations is a product of this part of their biological makeup, they could hardly help the manner in which they created their culture expressions and reacted to others, determining thus the events that make up world history. Ra'u Nefer goes on to say that this, and only this, I dare say, can establish history and anthropology as science, as well as to put the study of religion on a scientific basis. Amen. I'll leave you guys with this word, then we'll go into discussing, going into the Black founders of civilization in our next segment tomorrow. Shem Ehem Hetep. Shem Hem Hetep. Shem Himatep. Shem Himatep. Shem Him. So I say that over and over. Shem. Shehim. Because they capitalize words of emphasis. Shehimitep. And then the dashes show more of a separation. Shehimitep. So what I'm saying is, I go forth in peace. Thank you for listening tonight. Keep following up here shortly. Peace and blessings. Physiognomical. All right, I was going to come back with that terminology, but it is the art of determining characters. Wow, that's interesting. So finally, we must note that racial differences go beyond the color of the skin, the type of hair, the skeletal structure, and other physiognomical items. And that, again, would be the characteristic of a person. So I would say it goes into the physiognomical. So, I just wanted to throw that segment in there because, well, I don't know if it's the older I get, I'm either not remembering how to pronounce these words or you get the gist of the word. And later on, you can break it down. Physiognomical. It's like there's always a new word I'm learning. P-H-Y. P-H-Y-S-I-O-G-N-O-M-I-C-A-L. Okay. So, again, it's the art of discovering temperament and character from outward appearances, such as the facial feature held to show qualities of mind or character by their configuration or expression, for those who didn't know.